Listen carefully, Western governments watching your African extraction system collapse. 3 minutes ago, I confirmed all 10 sovereignty projects are fully operational, terminating 65 years of your control over our infrastructure, currency, military, and healthcare. You assumed we needed white supervision forever and thought sovereignty required your permission. You were dead wrong. I built this with Chinese technology, Russian weapons, and African gold. Your extraction ended forever. On December 12, 2025, at 10 WOWs a.m. in Ouagadougou, I stood in the Presidential Command Center with my cabinet and received the final implementation reports for all 10 sovereignty projects we launched between January 2023 and November 2025. Every single project achieved full operational status ahead of schedule. Every single project exceeded performance targets. Every single project proved Western control of African systems was unnecessary, exploitative, and replaceable. I spent 3 years building parallel infrastructure across 10 critical sectors: currency, railways, military production, solar energy, food security, gold mining, telecommunications, media, education, and healthcare, specifically designed to function independently of Western systems, financing, and approval. Western analysts predicted every project would fail. They said African nations lacked technical capacity. They said Chinese partnerships would produce inferior results. They said Russian military equipment couldn't match Western standards. They said we'd come crawling back to the World Bank, IMF, and Western contractors within months. They were completely wrong about everything. The 10 projects collectively cost $127 billion to build over 3 years. We financed them entirely through Chinese development loans at 2.1% average interest, Russian defense credits at 1.8% interest, and African sovereign wealth investments, zero Western money involved. The 10 projects now generate $43 billion in annual economic value through cost savings, new revenue streams, and eliminated Western extraction, meaning they'll pay for themselves in 3 years and deliver pure profit afterward. But the real value isn't financial, it's strategic. These 10 projects terminate Western leverage across every sector they use to control African economies and politics. France can't threaten to cut development aid because we replaced their infrastructure with Chinese-built alternatives. The United States can't threaten to suspend military assistance because we produce our own weapons with Russian partnerships. The World Bank can't impose lending conditions because we trade in our own currency and don't need their loans. Western pharmaceutical companies can't price gouge our healthcare systems because we manufacture our own medicines. Western control depended on African dependency. We systematically eliminated that dependency across 10 sectors simultaneously, and now they have nothing left to leverage against us. Listen carefully to what these 10 projects actually are and how they work, because this is the blueprint every developing nation will copy to achieve genuine sovereignty. I'm going to walk through each project in the order we launched them, explaining the Western extraction system it replaced, the alternative infrastructure we built, the results we achieved, and why the West can't reverse what we've done. Project 1 launched on January 15, 2025, the Afro currency system. I already told you about this one in detail, but here's what matters for understanding the other 9 projects. The Afro eliminated Western monetary control over 49 African nations, ended the CFA France's 80-year extraction mechanism, and generated $28 billion in annual savings by eliminating currency conversion fees, remittance costs, and debt service payments to Western banks. Those $28 billion in annual savings became the financing mechanism for projects 2 through 10 because money that previously flowed to Paris, London, and New York now stays in African economies and funds African infrastructure. The Afro wasn't just a currency. It was the foundation that made every other sovereignty project financially viable. As of December 12, 2025, the Afro processes $2.8 billion in daily transactions across 49 African nations with 99.94% uptime, holds $31 billion in gold-backed reserves, and trades at 1 Afro equals 1.24 USD, higher than the dollar. Western economists said it would collapse in weeks. It's been 11 months, and it's stronger than ever. Project 2 launched on March 8, 2025, the Trans-Sahel Railway Network. This project directly challenges French transportation monopolies that controlled West African logistics for 120 years. Here's the system we replaced. France built colonial-era railways from 1880 to 1960 designed exclusively to extract African resources to coastal ports for export to Europe, with zero consideration for intra-African connectivity. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger Three landlocked Sahel nations covering 2.4 million square kilometers had virtually no railway infrastructure because France didn't want us trading with each other, they wanted us exporting to them. As of 2022, Burkina Faso had 622 kilometers of colonial-era railway, mostly non-functional. Mali had 729 kilometers, half of it unusable. Niger had 0 kilometers of operational railway. Moving goods between Ouagadougou and Niamey, two capitals only 520 kilometers apart, required trucking on dangerous roads that took 14 hours, cost $340 per ton, and resulted in 180 deaths annually from accidents and bandit attacks. France proposed building a modern railway in 2018 and quoted $8.4 billion for 2,400 kilometers of track connecting the three capitals, with a 12-year construction timeline and loan terms at 6.8% interest requiring us to hire French contractors. We rejected it because the math showed we'd pay $14.7 billion total over 20 years for infrastructure that primarily served French mining companies extracting our uranium, gold, and lithium. On March 8, 2025, we signed the Trans-Sahel Railway Agreement with China Railway Construction Corporation and China Railway Group. The agreement covered 2,150 kilometers of standard gauge railway connecting Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Niamey, plus branch lines to mining regions in all three countries. Construction cost, $4.2 billion financed by China Development Bank at 2.1% interest over 15 years, totaling $5.3 billion, less than half what France quoted and one-third the interest rate. Construction timeline, 24 months from March 8, 2025 to March 8, 2027, but the first operational segment, Ouagadougou to Bobo Dioulasso in Burkina Faso covering 360 kilometers, completed early on November 28, 2025, and entered commercial service on December 1, 2025. As of December 12, 2025, that segment has transported 140,000 passengers and 28,000 tons of cargo in 11 days of operation, with ticket prices 60% cheaper than bus transport and cargo costs 73% lower than trucking. The Bamako to Kayes segment in Mali, covering 490 kilometers, completed on December 10, 2025, and enters service December 15, 2025. The entire network will finish by March 2027, delivering 2,950 kilometers of modern railway for $5.3 billion total cost, $1.86 million per kilometer, compared to France's quote of $3.5 million per kilometer. We're building better infrastructure, faster, and for half the price because Chinese contractors aren't extracting colonial tribute with every invoice. The economic impact is already transforming regional trade. Before the railway, transporting 1 ton of goods from Ouagadougou to Bobo Dioulasso cost $84 by truck and took 9 hours. Now it costs $23 by rail and takes 3 hours. That 73% cost reduction makes Burkinabe agricultural products competitive in regional markets for the first time. Burkina Faso exports cotton, sesame, mangoes, and shea butter, but before the railway, transportation costs made these products too expensive to compete with Ivorian or Ghanaian alternatives. Now Burkinabe farmers can undercut competitors and capture market share across West Africa. By 2027, when the full network operates, we project $8.7 billion in annual trade growth across the three countries, $2.4 billion in annual savings from reduced transportation costs, and 340,000 new jobs in logistics, manufacturing, and agriculture sectors that become viable with rail access. France spent 120 years controlling our logistics to extract resources. We replaced their entire system in 24 months and increased economic output by $11.1 billion annually. They can't compete with that. Project 3 launched on April 22, 2025, the Sahel Defense Industries Complex. This project terminates Western military dependency that France and the United States exploited for 63 years to dictate African foreign policy. Here's what we replaced. Since independence in 1960, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger purchased weapons exclusively from France, the United States, and other Western suppliers who charged monopoly prices, imposed political conditions, and withheld spare parts whenever we pursued policies they opposed. A French-made Caesar 150 mm howitzer cost $7.8 million. American Javelin anti-tank missiles cost $240,000 each. Western infantry rifles cost $2,800 per unit, and every purchase required approval from Western governments who could veto sales if they disliked our political choices. When we expelled French troops in 2022 and 2023, France immediately suspended military cooperation agreements and blocked spare parts deliveries for French-made helicopters, armored vehicles, and artillery systems in our inventories, attempting to cripple our militaries as punishment for independence. That experience taught us we'd never achieve real sovereignty while Western nations controlled our weapons supply. On April 22, 2025, we inaugurated the Sahel Defense Industries Complex, a joint venture between Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, and Russia's Rozo-Buro-Nexport covering weapons production, ammunition manufacturing, and military vehicle assembly. The complex consists of three main facilities: a small arms factory in Ouagadougou, producing Kalashnikov AK-203 rifles, PKM machine guns, and SVD sniper rifles under Russian license; an ammunition plant in Bamako producing 7.62mm rifle ammunition, 12.7mm heavy machine gun ammunition, and 122mm artillery shells; and an armored vehicle assembly plant in Niamey, assembling Russian-designed Typhoon K mine-resistant vehicles and BTR-82A armored personnel carriers from knocked-down kits. Total construction cost, $2.8 billion, financed through Russian defense credits at 1.8% interest over 12 years. Construction timeline, 18 months from April 22, 2025 to October 22, 2026, but initial production began early in November 2025 as sections came online. As of December 12, 2025, the Ouagadougou Small Arms Factory has produced 24,000 AK-203 rifles, 3,400 PKM machine guns, and 840 SVD sniper rifles, enough to fully equip 3 Burkinabe infantry brigades with domestically produced weapons. Production cost per AK-203, $420 compared to $2,800 for Western rifles. The Bamako ammunition plant has produced 18 million rounds of 7.62mm ammunition, 2.4 million rounds of 12.7mm ammunition, and 34,122mm artillery shells, eliminating ammunition imports that previously cost Mali $180 million annually. The Niamey Vehicle Assembly Plant has completed 140 Typhoon K vehicles and 67 BTR-82A armored personnel carriers, with per-unit costs of $340,000 and $1.2 million respectively, compared to $1.8 million and $4.7 million for equivalent Western vehicles. By October 2026, when the complex reaches full operational capacity, we'll produce 120,000 rifles annually, 80 million rounds of ammunition annually, and 400 armored vehicles annually, enough to supply not just our three nations but export to other African militaries seeking to escape Western weapons monopolies. We've already received purchase inquiries from Chad, Central African Republic, Senegal, Guinea, and Togo. The strategic impact is devastating to Western military influence. France and the United States controlled African militaries by controlling weapons supply. If we didn't obey their foreign policy directives, they'd cut off weapons and spare parts, rendering our forces combat ineffective. That leverage disappeared the moment we started producing our own weapons. On November 30, 2025, the United States threatened to suspend military aid to Burkina Faso over our refusal to condemn Russian actions in Ukraine. I responded by touring the Ouagadougou Small Arms Factory on live television, holding an AK-203 rifle with "Made in Burkina Faso" stamped on the receiver and saying, "We don't need American weapons anymore. Suspend your aid. We'll arm ourselves." The threat evaporated. Western military leverage only works if you're dependent on Western weapons. We're not anymore, so their threats are meaningless. Project 4 launched on May 18, 2025, the Sahel Solar Energy Grid. This project eliminates French energy monopolies that Total Energies and EDF exploited for 65 years to extract billions through overpriced diesel and suppressed renewable alternatives. I already told you about this project when I described opening Africa's largest solar farm, but here's the full scope. The Sahel Solar Energy Grid isn't just Burkina Faso's 2,100 megawatt facility. It's an integrated network of solar installations across Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, Chad, Mauritania, and Senegal, totaling 8,400 megawatts of generation capacity connected by high-voltage transmission lines, enabling cross-border electricity trade. Burkina Faso's 2,100 megawatt facility, which I inaugurated on December 15, 2025, anchors the western section. Mali's Aoun 800 megawatt facility in Kayes region, currently 67% complete, will come online in March 2026. Niger's 1,400 megawatt facility in Agadez region, currently 54% complete, will come online in May 2026. Chad's 200 megawatt facility near N'Djamena, currently 41% complete, will come online in July 2026. Mauritania's 100 megawatt facility in Nouakchott region, currently 38% complete, will come online in August 2026. Senegal's 800 megawatt facility in Thiès region, currently 29% complete, will come online in October 2026. Total investment, $8.9 billion financed by China Development Bank at 2.1% interest over 20 years, with construction by Longyi Green Energy Technology, JA Solar, and Trina Solar, Chinese companies that delivered every facility below budget and ahead of schedule. Total system cost when fully operational in October 2026, $11.2 billion including financing costs. Annual electricity generation, 21,000 gigawatt hours. Annual cost savings compared to diesel generation, $8.4 billion, meaning the entire system pays for itself in 1.3 years. But the real value is energy independence. 6 Sahel nations that previously imported 89% of energy from French-controlled suppliers now generate clean electricity domestically at 1/5 the cost. Total Energies lost $14.2 billion in annual Sahel revenue when we terminated their contracts and replaced diesel with solar. EDF lost $3.8 billion in annual revenue when we nationalized distribution systems and expelled their management teams. French energy extraction from the Sahel, which totaled $18 billion annually from 1960 to 2024, dropped to zero in 18 months. They built their energy monopoly over 65 years. We destroyed it in less than 2 years. Project 5 launched on June 24, 2025, the Alliance Food Security Program. This project eliminates Western agricultural dependency that France, the United States, and European agribusiness corporations exploited to control African food systems and suppress local production. Here's the problem we solved. Despite having 60% of the world's uncultivated arable land, Africa imports $43 billion in food annually because colonial and post-colonial policies systematically destroyed African agricultural self-sufficiency. France forced Sahel nations to grow cash crops for export, cotton, cocoa, coffee, peanuts, instead of food crops for domestic consumption, creating permanent food deficits. Then, French and American agribusiness corporations sold us wheat, rice, and corn at subsidized prices that undercut African farmers and destroyed local production. Burkina Faso, which has 9 million hectares of arable land and ideal growing conditions for sorghum, millet, rice, and maize, imported $840 million in food in 2024. A nation that should export food was importing it because our agricultural sector was deliberately underdeveloped to benefit Western exporters. On June 24, 2025, the Alliance of Sahel States launched the Alliance Food Security Program, a $6.8 billion initiative to achieve food self-sufficiency across Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger by 2027. The program has 4 components: land development, irrigation infrastructure, mechanization, and market systems. For land development, we're clearing and preparing 4.2 million hectares of previously uncultivated land across the 3 countries for cereal production: sorghum, millet, rice, maize, and wheat. Chinese agricultural engineering companies are executing the land clearing using heavy machinery at costs 70% lower than Western quotes. For irrigation, we're building 340 small-scale irrigation systems drawing water from the Niger River, seasonal rivers, and groundwater aquifers, providing year-round water access to 2.8 million hectares. Chinese contractors are building the irrigation infrastructure using proven designs from Chinese agricultural zones. For mechanization, we're purchasing 12,000 tractors, 8,400 combine harvesters, and 28,000 smaller implements from Chinese manufacturers at prices 40% to 60% lower than Western equipment. A John Deere tractor costs $180,000. A Chinese YTO tractor with equivalent specifications costs $68,000. For market systems, we're building 240 grain storage facilities, 67 processing plants, and improved road connections to ensure farmers can store, process, and sell their harvests at fair prices instead of losing crops to spoilage or selling at distressed prices to exploitative middlemen. Total cost, $6.8 billion financed by China Development Bank at 2.1% interest over 15 years, totaling $8.6 billion with financing. As of December 12, 2025, the program is 58% complete, 2.4 million hectares cleared and planted, 197 irrigation systems operational, 7,100 tractors and 4,900 harvesters delivered, and 89 storage facilities completed. The 2025 harvest, which concluded in November, yielded 8.7 million tons of cereals across the three countries, a 340% increase compared to 2024 and enough to cover 76% of our combined domestic consumption. By the 2026 harvest, we'll achieve 100% self-sufficiency. By 2027, we'll produce surpluses for export to other African nations. The economic impact is massive. 2.4 billion in annual savings from eliminated food imports, 1.8 billion in new agricultural revenues from increased production, and 840,000 new jobs in farming, processing, and logistics. Western agribusiness corporations that extracted $2.4 billion annually from Sahel food imports just lost their entire market. African farmers who were forced to grow cotton for French textile companies at 0.68 per kilogram are now growing sorghum for African consumers at $420 per ton, earning 3 times more income. We didn't just achieve food security, we terminated Western agricultural colonialism. Project 6 launched on July 30th, 2025, the Pan-Sahel Gold Consortium. This project eliminates Western mining monopolies that Canadian, British, Australian, and French companies used to extract $180 billion in African gold over 30 years, while paying royalties averaging 3%. Here's the theft we stopped. Western mining companies operated across the Sahel under exploration and production licenses granted by compliant post-independence governments in exchange for bribes. These licenses typically gave mining companies 97% of revenues, while host governments received 3% royalties, meaning for every $1 billion in gold extracted from Burkina Faso, foreign shareholders received $970 million, and Burkina Faso received $30 million, despite the gold coming from our soil, dug by our workers, using our water and electricity, and leaving environmental destruction we'd have to remediate. Burkina Faso produced approximately 60 tons of gold annually from 2015 to 2024, worth $3.6 billion at average prices. Over 10 years, we produced $36 billion in gold and received $1.08 billion in royalties, while foreign mining companies took $34.92 billion. That's not mining, that's organized theft. On July 30th, 2025, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger simultaneously announced nationalization of all major gold mining operations and formation of the Pan-Sahel Gold Consortium, a state-owned mining conglomerate that would operate all major mines under new terms. We terminated licenses for 14 major Western mining companies, including Barrick Gold, Endeavour Mining, B2 Gold, Resolute Mining, IAM Gold, Teranga Gold, and Anglo Gold Ashanti. We offered them 3 options: accept new terms giving host governments 60% of revenues and mining companies 40%, sell their operations to the consortium at fair market value, or leave with 0 compensation and face lawsuits for environmental damages and tax evasion. 9 companies chose option 1 and accepted new terms. 3 companies chose option 2 and sold out. Barrick Gold sold its Lulo Gunkodo complex in Mali for $2.8 billion. Endeavour Mining sold its Houndé mine in Burkina Faso for $1.4 billion. And Resolute Mining sold its Syama mine in Mali for $840 million. 2 companies, B2 Gold and IAM Gold, chose option 3 and refused to negotiate. We seized their assets under national security provisions, and they're currently filing failed arbitration claims at Western commercial courts that have no jurisdiction over sovereign nationalization decisions. The consortium, capitalized with $8.4 billion from the 3 governments plus Russian mining investment, now operates 23 major gold mines across the Sahel, producing a combined 124 tons of gold annually worth $8.7 billion at current prices. Under the old system with 3% royalties, our 3 governments would receive $261 million annually. Under the new system with 60% state ownership, our governments receive $5.22 billion annually, a 20-fold increase. That extra $4.96 billion in annual revenue funds, healthcare, education, and infrastructure without borrowing a single dollar from the World Bank. As of December 12, 2025, the consortium has been operating for 4.5 months, has produced 46 tons of gold worth $3.2 billion, and has delivered $1.92 billion to national treasuries, more revenue in 4 months than we received in all of 2024 under the old royalty system. But here's what matters strategically. We're not selling this gold to Western refineries in Switzerland and London where prices are manipulated and controlled. We're selling directly to China, India, Turkey, and Middle Eastern buyers who pay spot prices in yuan, rupees, lira, and dirhams, bypassing dollar transactions entirely. We're also holding 30% of production in national reserves to back the Afro currency. The 46 tons produced so far added 14 tons to Afro gold reserves, strengthening the currency and increasing our monetary sovereignty. Western mining companies that extracted $180 billion from Africa over 30 years just lost access to Sahel gold permanently. They're threatening arbitration and demanding compensation. We're ignoring them completely because their arbitration courts have no enforcement mechanism without military intervention, and Western nations don't have the political will to invade Africa over gold mines anymore. Project 7 launched on August 28, 2025, the Pan-African Fiber Optic Network. This project eliminates Western telecommunications monopolies that Orange, MTN, Vodacom, and Airtel exploited to extract $67 billion from African consumers over 20 years while delivering inferior service. Here's the system we replaced. African telecommunications were controlled by European companies, Orange, French, Vodacom, British South African, and others, who charged Africans the highest mobile and internet prices in the world while providing the slowest speeds and worst coverage. In Burkina Faso, mobile data cost $8.40 per gigabyte in 2024, compared to $0.68 per gigabyte in India and $1.20 per gigabyte in China. Why? Because Orange faced no competition and maximized extraction. International bandwidth connecting Africa to global internet infrastructure was monopolized by undersea cables owned by Western consortiums who charged African nations $340 per megabit per second per month, 12 times what Asian nations paid. The result, Africans paid more for worse connectivity, and billions of dollars flowed annually to European telecommunications shareholders. On August 28, 2025, the African Union launched the Pan-African Fiber Optic Network, a $12.4 billion project to build Africa-owned telecommunications infrastructure spanning 54 nations and 118,000 kilometers of fiber optic cable. The network has two components: terrestrial fiber connecting African capitals and major cities across the continent, and submarine cables connecting Africa to Asia, Europe, and the Americas independently of Western-owned cable systems. China's Huawei Marine Networks is building the submarine cables, 3 new routes totaling 38,000 kilometers connecting Lagos to Shenzhen, Mombasa to Mumbai, and Dakar to Fortaleza in Brazil. Huawei Technologies and ZTE Corporation are building the terrestrial fiber network, 80,000 kilometers of overland cable crossing deserts, mountains, and jungles to connect every African capital. Total construction timeline: 30 months from August 28, 2025 to February 28, 2028. Total cost: $12.4 billion financed by China Development Bank at 2.1% interest over 18 years, totaling $15.8 billion with financing. As of December 12, 2025, the network is 31% complete. The Lagos to Shenzhen submarine cable completed sea surveys and began laying cable in October 2025. The Mombasa to Mumbai cable is 44% laid, and the Dakar to Fortaleza cable is 28% laid. The terrestrial network has completed 24,800 kilometers of fiber connecting West African capitals. Dakar, Bamako, Ouagadougou, Niamey, Abuja, and Accra are now connected by African-owned fiber. This partial network is already operational and delivering results. International bandwidth costs dropped from $340 per megabit per second to $84 per megabit per second for connected nations, a 75% reduction. Those savings passed to consumers. Mobile data prices in Burkina Faso dropped from $8.40 per gigabyte in July 2025 to $2.80 per gigabyte in December 2025, a 67% reduction, because the state-owned telecommunications company now has affordable bandwidth and undercuts Orange's monopoly pricing. Internet speeds increased. Average download speeds in connected capitals increased from 8.4 megabits per second in July 2025 to 47 megabits per second in December 2025 because fiber provides vastly more capacity than the satellite and old copper systems previously used. When the full network becomes operational in February 2028, every African nation will have affordable, high-speed internet access independent of Western-controlled infrastructure. Telecommunications costs will drop 70% to 80% across the continent. African businesses will access global digital markets on equal terms with Asian and Western competitors. African students will access online education without prohibitive costs. The Pan-African Fiber Optic Network will save African consumers and businesses an estimated $18 billion annually in reduced telecommunications costs, paying for the entire project in 11 months of operation. Orange, MTN, Vodacom, and Airtel are panicking because they can't compete with state-owned networks offering equivalent service at one-third the price. They're threatening to exit African markets. We're encouraging them to leave faster so we can fully nationalize telecommunications and keep 100% of revenues instead of letting European shareholders extract profits. Project 8 launched on September 19, 2025, the African Media Alliance Network. This project eliminates Western media monopolies that BBC, France 24, CNN, Voice of America, and RFI use to control African narratives and spread propaganda supporting Western interests. Here's what we replaced. Western media outlets operated across Africa, presenting themselves as objective news sources, while consistently framing African governance as corrupt, African leaders as dictators, and Western intervention as humanitarian, all designed to maintain psychological colonization and justify Western interference. France 24 broadcasts in French across Francophone Africa, portraying France as a benevolent partner while ignoring French extraction and military crimes. BBC broadcasts in English portraying African nations as chaotic and dependent on Western aid while ignoring how Western policies create that chaos. These outlets didn't inform Africans, they programmed Africans to accept Western dominance as natural and inevitable. On September 19, 2025, we launched the African Media Alliance Network, a pan-African media consortium owned equally by 32 African governments, broadcasting in 18 African languages plus English, French, Arabic, and Portuguese. The network consists of Africa News Television broadcasting 24-hour news across satellite, cable, and internet platforms, Africa Digital News producing written content and investigative journalism, Africa Radio Network broadcasting in 18 languages across FM and digital platforms, and Africa Documentary Studios producing long-form content about African history, culture, and achievements. Total startup cost, $2.8 billion financed equally by participating governments. Infrastructure, production studios in Dakar, Lagos, Nairobi, Johannesburg, and Cairo, broadcast facilities in 32 capitals, satellite uplink capacity covering the entire continent, and digital distribution via mobile apps and websites. As of December 12, 2025, the network has been operating for 12 weeks and has achieved 140 million weekly viewers, listeners, readers across television, radio, and digital platforms, making it the third largest media outlet in Africa by reach, behind only local mobile networks and WhatsApp. The network's editorial policy explicitly rejects Western framing. We report African news from African perspectives, we celebrate African achievements, Western media ignores, we investigate Western extraction and military crimes Western media covers up, and we provide platforms for African leaders to speak directly to African citizens without Western media distortion. For example, when I nationalized gold mines in July 2025, BBC called it seizure of foreign assets and interviewed Canadian mining executives calling it theft. They didn't interview a single Burkinabe citizen who explained why taking back our own gold isn't theft. Africa News Television covered the same story as recovery of stolen resources and interviewed Burkinabe miners, economists, and community leaders who explained exactly how Western companies had been stealing 97% of our gold for 30 years. Same event, completely different framing. One reinforces Western narratives, one tells the truth. The strategic impact is profound. For the first time since colonization, Africans have media that serves African interests instead of Western propaganda. Young Africans who previously consumed BBC and CNN now watch Africa News Television and see their own leaders explaining policies without hostile Western journalists interrupting. Diaspora Africans who previously had no access to non-Western African perspectives now follow Africa Digital News and understand what's actually happening across the continent. Western media outlets are losing African audiences rapidly. France 24's viewership in Francophone Africa dropped 47% since September 2025 because Africans are choosing African media over French propaganda. BBC's African audience dropped 34% in the same period. Western governments are panicking because they're losing the ability to control African narratives. Without media dominance, they can't manufacture consent for their interventions or justify their extraction as partnership. Project 9 launched on October 17, 2025, the Alliance of Sahel States University System. This project eliminates Western education monopolies that French, British, and American universities exploited to extract $24 billion annually from African students while programming them with Western ideological frameworks that justified continued Western dominance. Here's the problem. African nations produced millions of secondary school graduates annually, but had insufficient university capacity, forcing students to study abroad in France, the United States, Britain, and other Western nations if they wanted higher education. Those students paid tuition averaging $28,000 annually, money flowing from poor African families to wealthy Western institutions. Worse, Western universities taught African students that Western political systems were superior, Western economic models were universal, and African traditions were backwards. Intellectual colonization designed to produce African elites who'd govern their nations according to Western interests after returning home. Burkina Faso sent approximately 12,000 students abroad annually from 2015 to 2024, mostly to France. Those students and their families spent $336 million annually on tuition, housing, and living expenses. Over 10 years, Burkinabe families transferred $336 billion to France for education, money that should have built Burkinabe universities. On October 17, 2025, we inaugurated the Alliance of Sahel States University System, a network of new universities across Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger offering tuition-free higher education in science, technology, engineering, medicine, agriculture, and business. The system consists of Thomas Sankara University of Science and Technology in Ouagadougou, with capacity for 24,000 students, Modibo Keita University of Engineering in Bamako with capacity for 18,000 students, and Hamani Diori University of Agriculture in Niamey with capacity for 14,000 students, plus 27 smaller specialized institutes across the three countries. Total system capacity, 84,000 students annually. Construction cost, $4.2 billion financed by China Development Bank at 2.1% interest over 15 years. Construction timeline, 18 months from April 17, 2024 to October 17, 2025. Chinese contractors built all three main universities simultaneously using modular construction techniques, completing the entire system in less than 2 years. The universities opened for their first academic term on October 21, 2025. As of December 12, 2025, Week 8 of the first term, enrollment stands at 6,400 students across the system, 80% of capacity. Students pay zero tuition. Education is completely free, funded by government budgets using revenues from nationalized gold mines. Faculty consists of 240 professors and lecturers, 45% recruited from African diaspora academics working in Western universities who returned home for higher salaries and better research support, 35% recruited from Chinese universities who teach on 2-year or 3-year contracts while training African successors, and 20% recent African PhD graduates starting their academic careers. Curriculum emphasizes practical skills over Western theoretical frameworks. Engineering students learn to design infrastructure suited to African conditions. Medical students learn to treat diseases prevalent in Africa. Agriculture students learn to maximize yields in Sahel climate conditions. Business students learn to build enterprises serving African markets. We're not training students to work for Western corporations. We're training them to build African economies. The economic impact is transformative. The $336 million that Burkinabe students previously spent annually in France now stays in Burkina Faso, funding construction, salaries, equipment, and supplies, money circulating in our economy instead of France's. Multiply that across Mali and Niger, and we're retaining $680 million annually that previously flowed to Western universities. By 2027, when the system reaches full capacity, we'll retain $840 million annually. But more importantly, we're producing graduates who understand their purpose is serving African development, not climbing Western corporate ladders. By 2029, the Alliance of Sahel States University System will produce 21,000 graduates annually, engineers building African infrastructure, doctors treating African patients, agronomists feeding African populations, business leaders building African enterprises, all educated to serve Africa instead of the West. Western universities that extracted $24 billion annually from African students just lost their largest growth market because we built alternatives offering better education at zero cost. Project 10 launched on November 14, 2025, the Pan-Sahel Pharmaceutical Manufacturing Network. This project eliminates Western pharmaceutical monopolies that European and American drug companies exploited to extract $38 billion annually from African healthcare systems while denying affordable medicines and vaccines. Here's the crime we stopped. Western pharmaceutical corporations held patents on essential medicines and vaccines. then charged Africans prices 300% to 800% higher than production costs, knowing governments and patients would pay because the alternative was death. A 3-month supply of antiretroviral drugs for HIV treatment costs $840 in Burkina Faso when the actual production cost is $68. Western pharmaceutical companies added 1,235% markup. Western governments defended these monopolies through intellectual property laws and threatened trade sanctions against any nation that produced generic versions. The result? Millions of Africans died because they couldn't afford medicines that cost pennies to produce, while Western pharmaceutical executives earned billions. On November 14, 2025, we inaugurated the Pan Sahel Pharmaceutical Manufacturing Network, a system of modern pharmaceutical factories across Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger producing generic versions of essential medicines and vaccines for African markets. The network consists of 8 manufacturing facilities producing antiretroviral drugs, antibiotics, antimalarials, vaccines, insulin, cancer medications, and other essential medicines. Total construction cost, $3.6 billion financed by China Development Bank at 2.1% interest over 15 years, with construction by Chinese pharmaceutical equipment manufacturers and technology transfer from Indian generic drug companies, including Cipla, Dr. Reddy's, and Sun Pharma, who pioneered breaking Western drug monopolies. Construction timeline, 14 months from September 14, 2024 to November 14, 2025. The facilities began production immediately upon inauguration. As of December 12, 2025, week 4 of operation, the network has produced 2.4 million units of antiretroviral drugs, 8.7 million courses of antibiotics, 14.2 million antimalarial treatments, and 240,000 doses of insulin. Production costs average 12% of Western pharmaceutical prices. We produce antiretroviral drugs at $78 per 3-month supply compared to $840 Western prices. Antibiotics at $340 per course compared to $28 Western prices. Antimalarials at $180 per treatment compared to $14 Western prices. We sell these medicines at cost plus 15% to cover operations and reinvestment, meaning our antiretrovirals retail at $89.70 compared to $840 Western prices, a 89% reduction. The health impact is already visible. HIV patients who previously couldn't afford treatment are now accessing medications. Malaria mortality is dropping in regions with new supply. Diabetes patients are getting insulin reliably instead of rationing doses. By March 2026, when the network reaches full production capacity, we'll produce enough medicines to cover 100% of essential drug needs for Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, eliminating imports that previously cost our 3 governments $2.8 billion annually. By June 2026, we'll produce surpluses for export to other African nations. We've already received purchase commitments from Chad, Senegal, Benin, Togo, Guinea, and Ghana worth $1.4 billion annually. The economic model is devastating to Western pharmaceutical monopolies. We produce at 12% of their costs, sell at 20% of their prices, and still generate healthy profits because their markups were pure extraction. Western pharmaceutical companies that extracted $38 billion annually from African healthcare systems are losing market share every month as African governments switch to cheaper African-produced alternatives. They're threatening patent infringement lawsuits. We're ignoring them completely because African lives matter more than Western pharmaceutical profits, and will defend our right to produce essential medicines in any international forum. Now let me tell you what these 10 projects mean together, because the individual projects are impressive, but the systemic impact is revolutionary. These 10 projects collectively eliminated Western control over currency, transportation, military supply, energy, food, mining, telecommunications, media, education, and healthcare. The 10 sectors Western nations used to dominate African economies and politics for 65 years. Each project independently weakens Western leverage. Together, they terminate it completely. France can't threaten to cut development aid because we replaced French infrastructure with Chinese alternatives across 5 sectors. The United States can't threaten to suspend military assistance because we produce our own weapons. The World Bank can't impose austerity because we trade in afros and don't need their loans. Western pharmaceutical companies can't price gouge because we produce our own medicines. Western media can't control narratives because we built our own outlets. Western universities can't extract tuition because we built our own institutions. Every mechanism Western nations use to enforce African dependency has been systematically dismantled and replaced with alternatives they can't control. The economic impact is staggering. The 10 projects cost $127 billion to build over 3 years. They generate $43 billion in annual value through cost savings and new revenues, $28 billion from the Afro, $11.1 billion from railways, $2.8 billion from food security, $496 billion from gold, $8.4 billion from energy, $18 billion from telecommunications, $840 million from education, and $1.4 billion from pharmaceuticals. That's a return on investment of 34% annually, meaning the projects pay for themselves in 3 years and deliver pure profit forever after. But more importantly, that $43 billion in annual value represents money that previously flowed to Western corporations and banks, but now stays in African economies. We didn't just build infrastructure, we terminated 65 years of extraction and redirected those wealth flows to African development. The political impact is even more profound. For 63 years since independence, African nations pursued sovereignty within Western-designed systems. We sought better loan terms from the World Bank instead of building alternatives to World Bank lending. We negotiated higher royalties from Western mining companies instead of nationalizing mines. We asked Western media to cover us fairly instead of building our own media. That approach failed because Western systems were designed to extract, not empower. These 10 projects represent a fundamentally different strategy. Instead of reforming Western systems, we built parallel systems that make Western systems irrelevant. We don't need better World Bank loan terms because we don't need World Bank loans anymore. We don't need fairer media coverage because we control our own narratives now. We don't need Western pharmaceutical companies to lower prices because we produce our own medicines. The 10 projects transform sovereignty from an abstract goal into concrete reality. We're materially independent of Western control across every critical sector, and the contagion is spreading exactly as I planned. On December 2, 2025, Senegal announced plans to join all 10 projects and contribute $8.4 billion to expand infrastructure to cover their territory. On December 5, 2025, Chad announced similar intentions with $4.2 billion in commitments. On December 8, 2025, Guinea, Togo, and Benin formed a working group to study joining the railway, energy, and pharmaceutical projects. On December 11, 2025, the East African Community, Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, South Sudan, and the Democratic Republic of Congo announced they would build equivalent projects modeled directly on our 10-project framework with $68 billion in combined financing from China. On December 12, 2025, today, the Southern African Development Community announced preliminary discussions for similar initiatives covering 16 nations. The 10-project model is becoming the blueprint for genuine African sovereignty. Within 5 years, I predict 48 of 54 African nations will have implemented equivalent programs. Within 10 years, Western economic control of Africa will exist only in history books. So here's my message to France, the United States, Britain, the World Bank, IMF, and every Western institution that spent 65 years extracting wealth from Africa while calling it partnership, development assistance, humanitarian intervention, or whatever euphemism disguised systematic theft. You lost. You lost completely, irreversibly, and permanently. You lost not because of Russian propaganda, not because of Chinese manipulation, not because of my personal charisma or radical ideology, but because you spent 65 years since African independence in the 1960s, proving through your actions that Western partnership was predatory relationship designed to extract African wealth while maintaining African subordination. You lost because Africans watched, learned, and finally understood that everything you promised, prosperity through Western investment, development through Western loans, security through Western military presence, progress through Western guidance, was a lie designed to keep us dependent while you extracted $2.8 trillion from African economies between 1960 and 2025. You lost because you believed African dependency was permanent structural reality reflecting inherent African incapacity rather than deliberately engineered policy you maintained through specific mechanisms. You told yourselves and told the world that Africa remained poor and dependent because Africans lacked capacity for self-governance, lacked technical expertise for modern development, lacked capital for infrastructure investment, lacked institutions for economic management, and lacked education for technological advancement. Those explanations absolved you of responsibility for African poverty by attributing it to African deficiencies rather than Western extraction, but those explanations were always lies covering the truth. Africa remained poor and dependent because you engineered that poverty and dependency through deliberate policies preventing African development that would threaten Western interests. You engineered African monetary dependency by forcing 14 nations to use the CFA franc printed in France and backed by reserves held hostage in French treasury accounts, extracting $832 billion over 65 years through that monetary colonization mechanism alone. You engineered African debt dependency by offering loans with interest rates 300% to 400% higher than you charged your own citizens, then imposing structural adjustment programs when countries couldn't repay, forcing privatization of African assets that Western corporations purchased at fire sale prices. You engineered African technological dependency by refusing technology transfer, protecting intellectual property that prevented African manufacturing, and selling Africans finished goods at markup prices instead of helping us build industries producing those goods ourselves. You engineered African food dependency by forcing cash crop production for export to Western markets instead of food crop production for African consumption, creating permanent food deficits you profited from filling with subsidized Western agricultural exports. You engineered African military dependency by supplying weapons with maintenance requirements and spare parts you controlled, enabling you to cripple African militaries by cutting supplies whenever African governments pursued policies you opposed. Every dependency was deliberately created and maintained because African dependency was profitable for Western institutions and essential for Western control. You didn't want African development. You wanted African subordination. You didn't offer partnership. You imposed extraction with partnership rhetoric. When we finally understood this fundamental truth and decided to break every dependency simultaneously through the 10 sovereignty projects, you lost the foundation of 65 years of neo-colonial control. You lost because you believed we lacked capacity to build alternatives when we actually lacked financing and political will. And once we secured alternative financing and generated political will, we built alternatives faster and better than you ever imagined possible. You told us for 65 years that building continental currency systems required decades of institutional development, that constructing modern railways required Western engineering expertise, that establishing sophisticated banking networks required Western financial management, that creating technology infrastructure required Western companies, that achieving food security required Western agricultural science. All lies. We built the Afro currency system in 16 months from August 2023 to January 2025, designed it, secured gold backing, developed blockchain infrastructure, launched it across 49 nations, and achieved 890 million wallet activations in 3 days. We built the Trans-Sahel Railway with Chinese contractors completing 2,850 kilometers in 24 months, half the time and half the cost of your estimates. We built Alliance of African Prosperity Banks with 87 banks capitalized at $340 billion and operational across 42 nations in 15 months. We built Pan-African Fiber Optic Network connecting 54 capitals in 30 months. Every project you said was impossible or would take decades, we completed in 12 to 30 months because we had what we previously lacked: Chinese financing at 2.1% interest instead of your 6% to 8% interest, and political will from African leaders who finally stopped believing your lies about African incapacity. Chinese loans gave us financing at interest rates 1/4 to 1/3 what you charged, with no political conditions attached, and with technology transfer you refused for 65 years. That financing enabled construction at speeds and costs you couldn't match because Chinese contractors weren't extracting colonial tribute with every invoice the way French, American, and British contractors did for 65 years. My generation of African leaders provided political will by recognizing that accepting short-term costs of defying you, sanctions, aid cuts, diplomatic isolation, was preferable to accepting permanent costs of remaining subordinate to systems designed to extract from us forever. Previous generations of African leaders feared your retaliation more than they valued African sovereignty. My generation values sovereignty more than we fear your retaliation. That shift in political will, combined with Chinese financing, unlocked African capacity you spent 65 years suppressing. You lost because you believed threatening us would work when threats only work against adversaries who need you, and we don't need you anymore across any critical sector where you previously held leverage. You threatened to cut foreign aid if we adopted the Afro. We financed development through Chinese loans and nationalized resource revenues, eliminating aid dependency. You threatened to impose sanctions if we nationalized mines. We sold resources to China, India, and Turkey who don't enforce your sanctions, eliminating market dependency. You threatened to suspend military cooperation if we expelled your bases. We purchased Russian weapons and built domestic arms production, eliminating weapons dependency. You threatened to deny us credit if we built our own banks. We capitalized alliance banks with African reserves and sovereign wealth funds, eliminating lending dependency. You threatened to isolate us diplomatically if we opposed you in international forums. We coordinated with 54 African nations voting as unified bloc, making your isolation threats worthless when we isolated you instead. Every threat you made assumed we had no alternatives and would capitulate rather than face costs of defying you. But we had alternatives you didn't know we were building. We accepted costs you didn't think we'd accept, and we called your bluff on every threat. France threatened Burkina Faso with economic consequences in 2022 when we expelled French troops. We absorbed economic costs through alliance solidarity and Russian partnership, and our economy grew 6.8% in 2023 despite French sanctions. The United States threatened to designate us as state sponsors of terrorism in 2025. We coordinated with 54 African nations promising collective withdrawal from U.S. counterterrorism cooperation, and the United States backed down within 48 hours. Your threats only worked for 65 years because previous African leaders believed you had power you no longer have. Once we tested your threats and discovered they were largely bluffs, your leverage evaporated permanently. You lost because you believed your systems were irreplaceable when they were just first movers who used historical advantage to prevent competition. You built dollar dominance in 1944 through Bretton Woods when no alternatives existed, but that doesn't mean dollar dominance is inherently superior to alternatives. It just means you established it first and used economic and military power to prevent alternatives from emerging. You built World Bank and IMF lending dominance in the 1960s when newly independent African nations had no other capital sources, but that doesn't mean your lending served African development better than alternatives. It just means you monopolized lending and used that monopoly to extract maximum profit while delivering minimum development. You built Western telecommunications dominance by denying Africans technology to build our own networks, but that doesn't mean Western technology is superior. It just means you prevented us from accessing alternatives that would have competed with your monopolies. Once we secured access to Chinese technology transfer, Russian military cooperation, and African resource wealth you no longer controlled, we built alternatives proving your systems were never irreplaceable. They were just protected monopolies. We built better systems faster and cheaper than you ever delivered because we weren't burdened by bloated Western costs and extraction markups. Your railways cost $3.5 million per kilometer because every contract included colonial tribute extracting maximum profit for minimum work. Our railways cost $1.86 million per kilometer because Chinese contractors bid competitively and delivered efficiently. Your telecommunications companies charged Africans $8.40 per gigabyte because monopoly pricing extracts maximum revenue. Our state-owned telecommunications charge $2.80 per gigabyte because we prioritize universal access over profit maximization. Your banks collected African deposits at 1.2% interest and lent back at 14.8% interest because extraction spreads generate shareholder returns. Our banks collect deposits at 4.2% interest and lend at 7.8% interest because development banking serves borrowers rather than extracting from them. Every system we built outperforms your systems for African users because our systems are designed to serve African development while your systems were designed to extract from African economies. Your systems weren't irreplaceable. They were just incumbent monopolies we finally replaced with superior alternatives once we accessed technology, financing, and partnerships you spent 65 years denying us. You lost because you believed African unity was impossible when your extraction was the unifying force that made cooperation necessary for survival. You spent 150 years from the Berlin Conference in 1885 to 2025 dividing Africa through arbitrary colonial borders, supporting dictators who served your interests against democrats who threatened them, financing opposition movements to destabilize governments pursuing independence, and promoting tribal and religious conflicts preventing African nations from coordinating against your exploitation. You succeeded at dividing Africa for 140 years from 1885 to 2025 because African nations lacked sufficient common cause to overcome divisions you deliberately created and maintained. But your own extraction eventually became the common cause unifying us. Every African nation, regardless of region, language, or political system, experienced Western extraction taking identical forms: monetary colonization through currency controls, debt colonization through exploitative loans, resource extraction through mining monopolies, military subordination through weapons dependency, and political manipulation through regime change operations. Once we recognized that Western extraction was a universal African experience transcending our individual national differences, African unity became rational survival strategy rather than idealistic aspiration. Alliance of Sahel states unified because Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger all faced French military presence, CFA franc extraction, and uranium theft. Coordinating against a common enemy made strategic sense. The alliance expanded to include Senegal, Chad, Guinea, and Mauritania because they faced identical French extraction and recognized a unified response was more effective than individual resistance. The African Unity Accord unified 54 nations because every nation faced some form of Western extraction and recognized continental coordination multiplied defensive power while isolation guaranteed continued victimization. Your extraction was so systematic, so comprehensive, and so obviously predatory that it overcame every division you created, unifying 1.4 billion Africans in shared determination to end 150 years of Western control. You unified Africa against yourselves through the brutality and ubiquity of your extraction. That's why you lost. These 10 projects aren't just infrastructure, banking systems, or operational capabilities. They're proof that everything you told us for 65 years was a deliberate lie designed to keep us subordinate by convincing us that subordination was inevitable. You said we needed your currency. We built our own with the Afro backed by 524 tons of gold, processing 124.6 billion in transactions across 49 nations in 3 days, proving African monetary sovereignty works better than dollar dependency that extracted $120 billion annually through inflation theft, conversion fees, and reserve devaluation. You said we needed your loans. We financed development with Chinese partners at 2.1% interest over 15 years compared to your 6% to 8% interest, saving $12 billion per $10 billion project, proving Chinese financing delivers 4 times more infrastructure for equivalent debt than Western lending designed to maximize interest extraction rather than development impact. You said we needed your weapons. We produce our own through Sahel Defense Industries Complex manufacturing 120,000 rifles annually, 80 million rounds of ammunition, and 400 armored vehicles at costs 40% to 75% lower than Western weapons, proving African military self-sufficiency is achievable and economically superior to dependency on Western arms that came with political conditions and supply vulnerabilities you exploited whenever we displeased you. You said we needed your energy. We built the largest solar network in the developing world with 8,400 megawatts generating electricity at 3.8 cents per kilowatt hour compared to 17 cents for diesel from French Total Energies, saving $8.4 billion annually and proving renewable energy provides superior economics and sovereignty compared to fossil fuel dependency on Western energy corporations that price gouged us for 65 years. You said we needed your food. We achieved agricultural self-sufficiency through the Alliance Food Security Program developing 4.2 million hectares, increasing production 340% in one harvest season, and eliminating 2.4 billion in annual food imports, proving African agriculture can feed Africa when we grow food for ourselves instead of cash crops for your markets. You said we needed your telecommunications. We built Pan-African fiber optic network reducing bandwidth costs 75% and data prices 67% while delivering speeds 6 times faster than your monopoly operators provided, proving African telecommunications serve African users better when we control infrastructure instead of paying colonial tribute to Orange, Vodacom, and Western telecommunications monopolies. You said we needed your media. We created African Media Alliance Network reaching 140 million users in 12 weeks, providing African perspectives on African news instead of Western propaganda framing African events to justify Western intervention, proving African journalism serves African interests better than BBC France 24 and CNN programming Africans to accept Western dominance as natural and African sovereignty as chaos. You said we needed your universities. We educated 67,400 students tuition-free in 8 weeks through Alliance of Sahel States University System, proving African higher education provides quality education serving African development when we're not forced to send students to Western universities charging $28,000 annually while programming them to govern according to Western ideological frameworks. You said we needed your medicines. We produce them at 12% of your prices through Pan-Sahel Pharmaceutical Manufacturing Network, delivering antiretroviral drugs at $78 per 3-month supply compared to your $840, proving pharmaceutical production cost pennies while your patents extracted billions by charging 1,000% markups justified through intellectual property laws protecting Western monopolies rather than serving human health. Every single claim you made about African incapacity requiring Western assistance was projection. You lacked the capacity to accept that we didn't need you, that your assistance was actually extraction, and that we could build better systems once we escaped your control. You're finished in Africa. Your extraction ended. Your leverage evaporated. Your systems are obsolete. Your threats are impotent. Your institutions are irrelevant. Africa is sovereign, and there's nothing you can do about it except watch 1.4 billion Africans build the prosperous, united, independent Africa you spent 150 years preventing us from building. You lost. We won. Africa is free.